So once again, everyone is welcome. We can now call on the chairperson, Professor Ama Oforiwa Edwonum, to commence the meeting. Thank you, Professor Ama.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chika, and welcome everyone. My name is Ama Oforiwa Edwonum. I'd like to start out by acknowledging and honoring our ancestors who walked this earth before us, for the footprints they left behind, for the audacity of hope, their fierceness, their wise wisdom. Their blood continues to flow in us. We are grateful. Friends, we have gathered here today to honor and celebrate our beautiful Dr. Sylvia Tamale, her many accomplishments, especially her book, Decolonization and Afrofeminism. It is a conversation with Dr. Tamale. Dr. Tamale will introduce her book. Two discussants will honor their take on the book. Dr. Tamale will come again with a response. Then we will take questions and comments. In Kwampachi Chichi Eja, good soup attract cheers. So I look forward to an inspiring, cordial, and stimulating conversation. Please, at this moment, turn off all your microphones. Make sure you are muted, please. I am humbled for this honor to introduce Dr. Sylvia Tamale. Since we are talking about decolonization, claiming and recentering indigenous knowledge, since we are celebrating Dr. Tamale today, I have chosen to offer my introduction as a praise poem in the manner of our beloved ancestors. Dr. Sylvia Tamale, warrior scholar, lawyer, sociologist, feminist activist, daughter of Uganda, former dean of law faculty, Makerere University, many publications, activism, and other accomplishments. Dr. Tamale, precious daughter of Africa, you cautioned African feminists against truncated feminism, careerism. You advised them to theorize, be radical, to be absolutely giddy, elated, exhilarated, and drunk on our cause, our objectives, our mission, and our obligations. Afrofeminism is for all of us, you advised. You found there is no law against nude protest. You penned when hens begins to crow to investigate how gender affects women in politics. Because the process of colonization erased, suppressed, and demonized all indigenous non-Western knowledge systems, in particular knowledges of women, you suggest that dismantling of several layers of complex and entrenched colonial structures and practices that pervade every aspect of our lives. Well-informed Tamale, like your fearless, indomitable, and proud ancestors before you, you would not be still. A formidable voice would not be silenced. You are bold, articulate, defiant, brilliance, precious beats. Because you crowed, Kokoroko, challenging discriminatory practices, defending women, sex workers, gays and lesbians, homosexuals and refugees. They named you Worst Woman of the Year in 2003. Ha! But like your defiant ancestors who challenged, resisted, and defied, you put that label on a button and wore it with pride. It was a badge of honor that you earned crowing. Kokoroko. Ghanaian elders say, when you climb a good tree, we push you up. You have climbed a good tree. Continue to climb. We are around to push you. We are here to encourage you. You are a model for all of us, even the beautiful ones who are not yet born. Dr. Tamale, we have gathered here for you. We acknowledge your contributions to our story. We have gathered here to celebrate you. We have gathered here to embolden you to continue growing. When a person performs good deeds, she does so for acknowledgement. We acknowledge you. Well done. Mo, Ayiko, Kazi Inzuri, Kokuroko. Dr. Tamale, our sister, you are welcome. I invite you now to give us some background about your book. Thank you.
Wow. Professor Ama, asante sana for that generous introduction. Wow. Oh, I would like to say that it is a great honor and privilege for me to be invited to have a conversation with the Decolonization in Africa group housed at the IAS, that is the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. A special thanks to Chikamba and your colleagues who organized this virtual conversation. Thank you. And to all the guests who have logged in tonight or this morning, depending on where you are to join this discussion. I'm really glad you made the time. Thank you. So what was my motivation for writing this book? Originally, I set out to write a textbook for the course Gender and the Law, which I teach here at Makerere University. There is an obvious gap in the available texts of the subject because it is extremely difficult to find relevant material that speak to African students in a single text. Since my retirement is around the corner, I thought to myself, what better time to make this my sabbatical project? That's what I set out to do. But if you look at the original structure of my draft manuscript and compare it with the table of contents of Decolonization and Afrofeminism, you would hardly recognize it. A few months into the project, and I started getting this sneaking feeling that what I was writing was becoming increasingly blasé, same old, same old. I imagine students yawning as they read the text. I was writing about African women's right to equality, their international and regional legal protections, and so on and so forth. It just sounded and felt very much like a broken record. Been there, done that, seen it, heard that, nothing's changed. So I decided to take a deeper look at some of the well-worn concepts that we discussed in the law. The research transported me on an unexpected journey and a sharp learning curve in post-colonial studies. It was an intellectual reawakening for me, a self-transformation. I had to disabuse myself and the readers of the Eurocentric worldview that I had been schooled in, one that blinded my mind's vision to alternative frameworks and blunted my critical thinking skills. Even with my PhD, the education that had been exposed to, steeped in siloed disciplines, dangerously limited my imagination of the multitude possibilities of reordering the world, a world beyond colonial hegemonies and ideologies. Okay, I may be exaggerating a little bit about my intellectual limitations, but honestly, the more I delved into the post-colonial ideologies, the clearer it became to me that Western notions such as gender equality, women's empowerment, will remain a mirage for most African women. So my inspiration for writing the book turned to a reflection of how we can pursue the Afro-feminist project using a decolonial approach. How do we shift our ways of knowing, ways of thinking, and our ways of being without undergoing a brain transplant? How do we undo the centuries-old damage wrought by imperialism and begin rewiring our senses to align them with decolonial feminist politics? It was obvious to me that the first thing we needed to do was to clearly identify the problem. So this book adds its quote unquote hand to the growing hands that are lifting the ideological veil which shrouds our understanding of the nature of the problems that we're dealing with. Most of us have been running this emancipatory race with a blurred black and white vision, using the wrong tools, employing the wrong methods, guided by skewed theoretical compasses, and celebrating half-baked victories. My hope is that this book will contribute to the grand project of shifting our collective consciousness, move us towards a more vivid, technicolor vision of the structural problems that we need to tackle, cast their contours in sharper relief, and filter out the confusing colonial and neo-colonial noises so that we can get on with the serious business of reclaiming our humanity as Africans, and especially as women. So by writing this book, I most certainly don't claim to be an expert in colonial and post-colonial studies. Indeed, some dots may not connect for the reader. The idea is to provoke the reader to engage in intellectual conversations, such as the one we are having now, across our multiple divides, to think, write, and act across disciplines, because transdisciplinarity is key to the decolonization and decolonial projects. So the book attempts to make a decolonial analysis of some dominant constructs, such as sex, gender, sexuality, customary law, human rights, gender equality, and family law. It uses decolonial lenses to illuminate the justice-oriented tools, such as intersectionality, transdisciplinarity, and Ubuntu, that can open up pathways for new forms of knowledge and different ways of knowing. It critiques the African higher education architecture, whose roots lie deep in colonialism, and suggests ways for a reconceived and revitalized Pan-African movement. It also highlights the new phenomenon of digital colonialism, which is part of the new Berlin-like scramble for Africa. I try to do all this using accessible language, but as most scholars are aware, it's very tough to explain complex and abstract concepts without using obtuse words like epistemology and ontology. But I did my best to break them down for the reader and to provide simple examples in order to concretize them. Still, my law students were telling me the other day that they started off reading the book with their dictionaries next to them, but assured me that once they got a hang of things, it was okay. Let's blame it on the colonial approaches to education, which are fragmented, linear, and siloed. The 9 chapters are not written in a sequential fashion, which means that you don't have to follow the chapters in their logical order, for you to comprehend the book. Each chapter can be read as standalone material with minimum cross-referencing. Hence, after reading the 2 introductory chapters, you can jump to any other part of the book that piques your interest. If you can close your eyes, everybody, if you can close your eyes and imagine the classic wet dog shake-off, it's always vigorous and strong. That's what I expect the book to achieve. Incite us to shake off all, our colonial ideological trappings, liberate our minds, and set out new forms of imagination for a revitalized and inclusive Africa. In a nutshell, I hope this book will provide radical clarity and understanding of the deep legacies of colonialism, imperialism, and patriarchy as we enter the last part of the first quarter of the 21st century. Thank Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tamale. That was straight to the point and very well done. Thank you. I am equally honored at this time to introduce our two discussants who will share their reflections on this book. Eric Naate Kumado is a doctoral student at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana, Legon, and a member of the Reading Group. And Emilia Amimata is a doctoral student at the University of Cambridge's Center for Gender Studies. You are both welcome. So now I'd like to please invite Eric to offer his reflection. Thank you, Eric. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Amma Edunum. Greetings to Professor Sylvia Tamale, and greetings to everybody who is with us this afternoon or morning or evening from wherever you are connected to. So, decolonization and Afrofeminism is a timeless and insightful contribution to two bodies of work, which have for years called for the need to resist oppression and transform societies of colonized people. Its publication is timely, especially in the times we live, where right-wing extremism is on the rise in the West, just as forces on the side of reason have also been gathering. This reading club and its partners across the world being one of those forces which recognize that the false notion of white supremacy and its attendant cultures, logics, institutions, epistemologies, and ontologies have had their day, and it is time to work out a new reality. It is within this context that Professor Sylvia Tamale's book appears. It's a book of many sides and arguments, ranging from history, philosophy, carrying a great concern for how history has been manipulated to serve imperialist interests. It calls for a proper understanding of what colonialism meant and still means to various sections of society. As she says, it's only when a proper understanding of colonialism is reached can the decolonization project succeed. The consequences of the failures in our understanding are evident today by the prevalence of pro-colonial discourses in various parts of our supposed post-colonial living. A few examples are our continued use of colonial languages, colonial names, monuments and landmarks named after colonizers still sit comfortably under our gaze, among others. There are a few issues I would like to highlight in this discussion. First of all, is the problem of the masculinist bias within the work and records of decolonial movements and discourses. Sylvia Tamale illustrates this bias through a historical analysis of the Pan-African movement, which started around the turn of the 20th century. Its first phase in the early decades of the century was driven by notable Caribbean actors such as Henry Sylvester Williams, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, George Padmore, yet no mention of Alice Kinloch and the role she played in bringing the first Pan-African Congress into being. In addition to Kinloch, there were the Nadal sisters, Paulette and Jean. Jean and Paulette Nadal were very visible in anti-colonial thinking and action in France in their time, and their contributions to the development of Afro-consciousness and the philosophical foundations of what became the negritude movement are undeniable. Yet, while the negritude movement came to be denounced years later, its history still credits the trinity of men, Leopold Sedar Senghor, Leon Damas, and Aimé Césaire. And this is usually accompanied by a loud silence on the role of the Nadal sisters. More Caribbean women writers like Suzanne Lacascade, Suzanne Césaire, Michelle Lacroixille, and Mayotte Capetia have at best been consigned to the margins of this history and at worst been completely excluded. This masculinist bias flowed into the second phase, which saw future presidents of African countries driving the Pan-African movement post-1945. That Pan-African Congress still had with it the problem of the absence of women, the absence in the records and in the participation. Yet, these were the years of Claudia Jones, of Mabel Dove-Dankwa, Fumilayo and Anikulapo Kuti. I'll return to Fumilayo and Anikulapo Kuti when I get to the part of my reflections, which deals with the need to decolonize our inherited colonial identities by renaming ourselves. When these men successfully gained independence for their countries, the problem persisted into their government. Here I'm speaking of Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and that generation of post-independence African leaders. My colleague here in my program at the Institute of African Studies, Gertrude Sarah Edu, is currently researching the gender policies of Nyerere and Nkrumah to determine whether they were committed to gender questions or were engaged in tokenism. So I guess we'll have to wait for her findings. But at present, it's not looking too good on them. Now, can we give these forefathers of Pan-Africanism a pass under the familiar line of reasoning that they were products of their times? If we can, why then was Amilcar Cabral different, as has been amply demonstrated by the book Claim No Easy Victories, The Legacy of Amilcar Cabral, edited by Feroz Manji and Bill Fletcher Jr. In this book, Cabral's thoughts and policies as a liberation fighter were shown to bear a very deep understanding of the status of women in the struggle for independence. Why was Samora Machel also different, and much later, Thomas Sankara? This clearly showed a lack of proper understanding of how colonialism worked in the minds of these respected icons of Pan-Africanism. Sylvia Tamale did help us with a cure for this malaise. She proposes Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality as the much-needed medicine for this illness. That by examining society as a matrix rather than as singular fragmented units, we develop sights into how interlocking systems of domination work simultaneously. We also recognize the multiple levels of oppression that various groups of oppressed people are subjected to. Not only does it offer us conceptual liberation, it also guides us in the area of praxis. Intersectionality will help us understand most of the oppressions that neocolonialism or coloniality bear today. Some of them remain to be discovered, while others have today fused with our everyday living as if they have had no violent past. Let us take, for example, the issue of names. Why do we still bear colonial names when our independence was a statement of our rejection of colonialism in all its manifestations? Why has this practice of colonial names become one of the hardly questioned legacies of colonialism? Beyond names, what about languages? What about rituals performed during rites of passage, such as naming, puberty ceremonies, marriages, and funerals? Does this not arise from a system of thought which has divided oppression into singular units rather than examining it in a more complex manner? Intersectionality is also extremely helpful in helping us understand the deep roots of colonialism. What remains of the system after the removal of colonizers from office, and how far the decolonial journey has come. With a focus on multiple systems of oppression operating simultaneously, a myriad of oppressive institutions, cultures, and their accompanying discourses are recognized. After seeing these systems, we get to understand why some of them passed safely into the post-colonial world. We get to understand how the material legacies and deep psychological scars still persist in plain sight, yet its victims seem to be mostly asleep or unaware of them. To this condition, Sylvia Tamale applies gripping imagery in the following words. Our decolonization and decolonial efforts have largely been simply picking at the scabs of the deep scars that colonialism and coloniality left in their wake. What is left of the legacy of colonialism manifests in three ways. First, there are the physical manifestations in the boundaries that still divide African people and remain sources of violent dispute and ethnocentrism. Other examples of these are in the odd names and monuments like Lake Victoria, Victoria Falls, Victoria Park, and numerous streets and schools that still represent colonizers as people worthy of veneration. The second way is related to the invisible forces that control our economies from outside. Those intriguing ideas sold to our desperate and sometimes ill-intended leaders, like the creation of enabling environments for business. I'd like to ask, whose business? Ideas like abolishing all forms of protectionism. Here again, I ask, what about the kind that makes these imperialist countries destabilize other countries so their corporations will thrive in those countries? Naomi Campbell's book, Shock Doctrine, explores this practice of a sophisticated system of preaching anti-protectionism on the one hand, yet practicing it actively by the USA government on the other hand. Some of these ideas are the need to stick to primary commodities because that is where Africa has a competitive advantage. Signing natural resource contracts with multinationals, which rob us blatantly, yet these are supposed to be the internationally approved standards, where an African country makes less than 10% when one combines the sum of royalties, taxes, and profits. Now, this excludes the illicit financial flows made possible by smart accounting methods employed by these same corporations. Recently, the same system of thought has introduced land reforms under the pretext of safeguarding agricultural gains. Yet evidence shows in separate studies by Kojo Amano and Georgie Chikata that these land reforms have mostly served to facilitate large-scale land acquisition by foreign capital, in addition to the robbing of African women of their access to land for farming, and in the process, creating widespread proletarianization of African women in the agrarian sector. The third way that it manifests is related to how we experience these visible and invisible expressions of oppression. We experience them as internalized discourses of power and submission in people's social, political, and religious lives. Let me comment a bit about religion and financially, and how it ensures that there's a financially wasteful activity we encounter here in Ghana and other parts of Africa, in that culture of marrying twice, having an African wedding and then a church wedding. Here in Ghana, the African wedding is called an engagement by people who understand English language and culture well as those who do not. But it really doesn't take much neural resources to test this misnaming. An engagement in its true meaning is a simple affair between two people. Over here, the event we call engagement has at least 3 formal meetings between the two marrying families, which could take place over months before a date is agreed upon for the main ceremony. How did this insulting reductionist misnomer make it through the independence struggles? Have we been picking at the scabs of the deep scars? Or as Alan Paton said in his novel, Cry the Beloved Country, have we been feeding an old man with milk and pretending he will one day grow to become a boy? Dwelling a bit on this colonial culture of misnaming, done deliberately to invalidate and reduce African institutions, and how our everyday use of colonial languages play the latent function of achieving these goals. For instance, African royals here are called chiefs. A glance through European writings about Africa before formal colonialism shows how they regarded our societies as countries and nations, and how those leaders were then called kings. But after the formal imposition of colonialism, these vocabularies were deliberately replaced with tribes and chiefs in order to serve the purpose of invalidating, delegitimation, and subjugating African institutions and how we perceive them. Sadly, these colonial practices managed to slip through the first phase of decolonization. We must not let them escape in this phase. In spite of the hostile environments and multiple challenges that the feminist movement in Africa has accomplished, in spite of the hostile environment and multiple challenges, the feminist movement in Africa has accomplished much. Sylvia Tamale traces the histories and connects it with the present times, making the book an important resource for students seeking to understand Afrofeminism. Figures like Queen Njinga and Sojourner Truth and their respective roles they played in their specific locations are mentioned. Other notable contributions by Audre Lorde, Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, Amina Mama are also noted. She chronicles the history of gender and women's studies and the feminist movement in Africa, laying before us old and new impediments, as well as its hopes and breakthroughs. How the Western feminist theoretical framework was questioned in Africa, and the new frameworks that were introduced as substitutes. Frameworks which seek to center Africa and race over the binary views of man-woman, which are empty of race, sexuality, class, among other factors. Some of these success stories include the growing number of departments in the universities teaching and researching gender and women's studies, the growing number of journals in which these research findings are published. Outside the university, there are research institutes, international and government agencies, and non-governmental organizations. Some of these organizations are transnational with local affiliates, creating a network of feminist activism across the continent, which is linked to similar networks across the world. This age of neoliberal transformation comes with a search for profit by large publishing corporations, which have acquired the first feminist journal in Africa. Two remain standing on their own terms for now. The general challenges of the African continent also rub off these specific gender-related challenges in the area of resource allocation and low numbers of women in the academy. In spite of these, however, feminist thinkers have successfully broken through and mounted challenges to mainstream thinking in history, political science, economics, religious studies, sociology, legal studies, labor studies, among others. These successes have broken new substantive, conceptual, methodological, and epistemological ground, which have extended the boundaries of our knowledge and have enhanced our understanding of African realities. Finally, the Pan-African movement of today seems to be growing out of its masculinist bias. The 7th Pan-African Congress held in 1994 marked a definite shift from the past in how they ensured that African women needed to be on the agenda. Congress Resolution number 8 on women and Pan-Africanism was passed, and it aims at more integration of women. Now, here are some critical reflections. The concept of coloniality used by Sylvia Tamale has not come without its controversies. While it has merit in explaining the global problem of colonialism and its cultures, logics, cognitive empires that define the colonized societies long after independence, do we not employ it at the risk of neglect of our experience? In an article published in July this year in the Third World Quarterly, Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni, himself a very reliant thinker on the works of Anibal Cujano, Walter Mignolo, Maldonado Torres, questions the dominance of these Latin American scholars over Africans like Sekanta Diop, Edward Wilmot Blyden, Kwame Nkrumah, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Samir Amin, who have also put in much work to coin and clarify concepts like neocolonialism and decolonizing the mind. While we continue to rely, now this second point is about languages. While we continue to rely on colonial languages, shall we pay attention to some unhelpful terms that serve the latent function of invalidating and reducing African institutions and people? Sylvia Tamale applies one of such terms a couple of times in her book, Colonial Master. Were the colonizers masters or they were interlopers? Beyond this problematic term, many others abound in our everyday use, some of them like tribe, the reference to kings as chiefs, African marriages deliberately misnamed as engagement, priests and priestesses referred to as fetish priests and priestesses, among others. The third point here is on names. An elder scholar asked me a question when I put up this ad on my WhatsApp status. He asked why 3 of the speakers of this event still bear colonial names when we are coming to discuss decolonization. To this point, I'd like to share the story of Fumilayo Anikulapo Kuti. I'm sure most of us are familiar with her name. The story of her identity began as Frances Abigail Olufumilayo Thomas. She made the first change by dropping the first 2 names, Frances and Abigail. and became Fumilayo Thomas. After marriage, she then became Fumilayo Ransom Kuti. Before she died, she made an additional change by eliminating the ransom for Anikulapo. She should be an inspiration for us who still bear colonial names and are uncomfortable with it. Decolonization is a multi-layered process which starts from the individual to the larger society, and our names matter in this process. I thought the following words by Chinua Achebe would be helpful as we reflect on this point. I quote, "Oppression renames its victims, brands them as a farmer brands his cattle with a common signature. It always aims to subvert the individual spirit and the humanity of the victim. And the victim will more or less struggle to remove oppression and be free." The same thought is expressed by Fela Anikulapo Kuti in his song Kolo Mentality. Finally, one major challenge faced by Afrofeminism is the attitude of male scholars and activists to gender issues. This ranges from outright resentment to uneasy accommodation. Rather than greeting gender and women's studies with the curiosity and interest it deserves, men are rather dismissive. And this attitude is particularly bizarre in groups participating in the worldwide search for resistance and transformation of colonized spaces. And yet, it is there anyway. We saw this within the Pan-African movement from the previous century, and we continue to see it today. A genuine search for an end to oppression is not achieved by turning a blind eye to the oppression that does not affect you, or to the privileges that one enjoys over others. In spite of our collective oppression as Black people, there are ways in which women experience oppression that men do not. The same way that people of non-binary sexual orientations are oppressed in ways that heterosexuals are not. To those men, look to Amilcar Cabral, to Samora Machel, and to Thomas Sankara, and add intersectionality in your analysis of oppression. A world where women are empowered does not threaten men of goodwill. It rather improves our collective reality. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Eric. Do you have a different name besides Eric, since we're talking about decolonization? What is it now? Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Na. That was a very powerful and insightful reflection. Really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
In the spirit of decolonization, I'd like to reintroduce our second discussant, Dela Amemate. You are welcome. Thank you, Dela.
Thank you. So I'm sure you guys saw the difference in the naming. When Prof introduced me first, we used Amelia, and I had to test and say, oh, I prefer Dela, because unfortunately, most of us are given English names at birth, and our certificates bear this name whether we like it or not. And so it has become very difficult to do the name shift. So everywhere I go, I have to do the two name thing until I say, okay, I know you see Amelia there, but I prefer Dela. So I'm hoping that maybe by the time I'm done with PhD, I'll be able to totally change it. Yeah. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm super excited to be here. Personally, I don't think I'm at that level where I deserve to be here. But since Dr. Tamale dedicated her book to we students, I want to be here, and I'm happy to be here. So my role, similar to Eric today, is to discuss Dr. Tamale's book. And what I want to do is I want to start with some of the major arguments that strike me as a feminist, an African, a student, an activist. And then I want to move on to some of the limitations I have noticed. And then at the end, I'm hoping to leave Dr. Tamale with some questions that I hope will enable us probe her more. So I know in many African languages, we say perfection does not exist. And I actually agree. But Dr. Tamale's Decolonization and Afrofeminism book is one of the best, if not the best, feminist writing I have come across. And I do not say this lightly, because from reading political science at the University of Ghana, going to America to study racism, and now studying gender studies. Most of the argument this book makes resonates with me, being that student where you feel like you are appreciated for your knowledge, and yet you are so empty. You know, you are asked to mention foreign feminists. You can mention them without any struggle. It's so easy for you. But then when it comes to your own home, then you start struggling. And why is that? Especially if you are the student who people say have so much knowledge. How come you do not know about your own those who came before you? But before I go into the details of the book, I want to say that even though the title of the book suggests Afrofeminism, this book is not actually limited to gender studies or feminist studies at all. And that's one of the things I love about the book, its interdisciplinary nature, the ability to move across borders. And you and I will agree, especially those of us who study in Africa, you agree with me that we've had an education system that continues to marginalize gender studies, whereby in a place like Ghana, majority of our population is actually women. But somehow we go through our entire life of education and nobody, you know, teaches us feminist critical lens to apply to the way we see things. And for me, that is one of the things this book brings to the table, giving us not just a Pan-Africanist lens to look at things, but a feminist lens as well. So I want to tell you a story. So I'm someone who uses social media a lot, sorry. And recently, Ghanaian feminists on social media complained that when TV stations and radio stations are discussing issues, they invite only women. And this is something most of us are already aware of in Ghana. And the media houses reacted by saying that, oh, what happened is, you know, sometimes we invite all these women, but they don't show up. And then among ourselves, we could discuss and realize that, no, we don't really receive the invitations. There are even times where the issues being discussed will be something like menstruation, and you see an all-male panel. And why is this? This is not because we do not have women who have the expert opinion to give on these issues. No, we just live in a society, a bubble that privileges male knowledge over female knowledge. It's as simple as that. And as I already mentioned, one of the ways that this is not clear to us is because we go through an education system that does not give us the necessary framework to be able to even recognize these things. And if you don't recognize the problem, how do you even begin to solve them? It just simply doesn't work. One of the things Sylvia Tamale emphasizes throughout her book, and Eric briefly mentioned it, is the Western education system within which we are operating right now. So I want you to help me do something. There's a reaction button. If you look below your screen, there's a place there called reactions. You could use that. You could use the thumbs up button, or you could just raise your hands. So I'm going to make 3 statements. If you think these 3 statements apply to you, please raise your hands. So first of all, which of us went through an education system where we use English or French as our primary language of instruction, even though English or French is not our mother tongue? Oh, okay. Great. My second question. Which of us in our education system have had our children or our children in our community started their basic education by A for apple, even though apples do not grow in the land they live in? Have you come across something like that? Oh, okay, thank you. And my third question. How many of us in this meeting right now have undergone training like Dr. Tamale talked about, or we are undergoing training right now with theories that are propounded by mainly white males from the West? How many of us? Okay. All right. So I guess you already know the point I'm trying to make with this exercise. As a student reading music at the University of Ghana a few years ago, at Keta Secondary School a few years ago, I was made to read about Beethoven, Mozart, and even though I finished school as the best music student, I left without knowing things about the people who made songs in my own language. And as I say this, I do not say it lightly at all, because the effects of that have lived with me since. And so many of us have gone through this type of education system. That is not because my music teacher wasn't good enough, but he himself belongs to a system where the textbook he has been given to use do not contain indigenous knowledge, right? And he himself had the kind of training that he's also giving me. And as we are in this space during this discussion right now, this sort of thing continues. Nothing is being done about it, because I guess it's either we have taken it as the norm and we continue to go on. Another important thing I want to talk about that Tamale's book highlight is the hostile treatment of feminists and the marginalization of feminism in most of our spaces. Dr. Tamale herself, as Professor Oforiwa mentioned, was crowned the West Woman in her country in 2003. And you ask, how did this happen? Did she kill someone? No, she didn't kill someone. What happened was she had the audacity to say gay, lesbian, and other non-binary identities should be included when we are looking at minority issues. That was all. The call that other people deserve to be treated just how you want to be treated. That was enough to label someone. And this is not peculiar to her. For so many of the feminists in this room, they will tell you that they even colleagues in their own department call them witches and other ugly names behind their back. And why do we continue to do this? Dr. Tamale goes on to point out that for Africa to move forward, Africa does not only need to think in a Pan-African way, Africa also needs to think in a feminist way. And personally, I think that if you are leaving half of your population behind, you haven't even started confronting the problem. You are joking, because when it comes to things like skills and brain power, it is not gender specific. So how can you even say you are addressing a problem when you continue to neglect half of the people who are going to bring the solution to the table? And one of the ways she shows this very clearly in the book is by discussing Pan-Africanism. When African, so let's talk about people like Winnie Mandela. This was a woman who stood by her husband. Even when he was in prison, she was the one who held everything together. But today you go online, you see some of the articles written about her, and you ask yourself, how about all the good things she did? How come you and I do not go to class, even in feminist studies, and read about the great work some of these women have done? Like Fela Kuti's mother that Eric mentioned. I didn't come across her in all my education until very recently when our reading group suggested that we read her. So these things continue to put us behind. One of the major things that we cannot end this discussion without mentioning is how, as Dr. Tamale herself already mentioned earlier, how white male-led capitalism destroyed Africa and continues to destroy Africa. So Let's talk about Facebook, since we the younger ones especially use Facebook a lot. So you and I, we are on Facebook, we use Google a lot, but Facebook and Google collect our data, right? And yet, what do we see happen? Facebook is responsible to the US government, by extension, the UK government. But Facebook isn't responsible to you and I, our government, like Ghana or Uganda government. No. And yet, it has our data. Let's talk about YouTube. African musicians upload their music to YouTube all the time, and they get no money or little money for it. And as for recognition, let's not even start, because African artists do not get the same recognition their colleagues in the West get. But YouTube turns around to sell this music to you and I. Where does the money go? YouTube isn't paying tax to Ghanaian government, and yet Ghanaians buy music on YouTube, right? Why are we even thinking these things are normal? I can go on and on and on, because as I said, the point that decolonization and Afrofeminism makes is amazing. It's like reading a book of the future. You feel that some of these arguments have been in your mind, but here is a book in front of you that have written everything about the things you think are in your head. So there's no way that I'll be able to discuss all that, especially before I run out of time. So the last thing I'll discuss in terms of the major contributions of the book will be about the brain drain that Africa is going through right now. So the only introduction I had to gender studies was very, very tiny discussion when I was doing political science in Legon. Meanwhile, I was very, very, very interested in gender equality, women's empowerment, mentioned them. But my education could just not give me the space to be able to do this. And as we are talking to you, as Dr. Tamale has mentioned, Eric has mentioned, gender studies continue to be pushed into the margins of the university. You go to a university and you realize that there's a gender studies center somewhere, but that center has about a few staff members and actually no money to do anything. And you realize that the institutions that have the money to carry out proper research are institutions that are in the global north, the West. And what happens is that countries come, they offer they say, okay, we have a scholarship for you. And then you leave your country. Mostly, we don't come back home. And that is it, your country has lost you. And that means that our continued relegation of these subject areas to the margins are hurting us, right? Because when another country takes the best brain out of your country continues to lose. And then Dr. Tamale also discusses gatekeeping. One of the things I and my colleagues are celebrating right now has to do with her saying that knowledge needs to be made free for everybody. Because see, a student is in Ghana, $30 book on Amazon is like a person's salary. How can she afford the book? It's impossible. So I agree fully with Dr. Tamale that we have to find a way to make knowledge available without commercializing it as is happening now. Now, I want to move to a few, should I say, limitations. I love this book so much that it's so hard for me to criticize it, but I'll try. So one of the first things I realized is that in the book, Dr. Tamale focused when it comes to ethnic discrimination, she focused on racism. And I feel like for so many African countries, racism doesn't seem like the biggest problem we face. In my view, I think that tribalism precedes racism. I feel like tribalism is the major problem that we face that disconnects us. For example, if you take the average country, we speak different languages. For us to even be able to speak to each other, we need to use a colonial language. And you enter spaces and your brother asks you, oh, why can't you speak this language? Do you not come from here? So for me, tribalism is more of a reality to me than racism if I'm in a space like Ghana. So I feel like Dr. Tamale should have put more emphasis on that. My second point has to do with so many scholars who have written about Africa's issues. I think they tend to discuss problems. Of course, scholars are not supposed to give us solutions, but they also have rich knowledge to be able to suggest things that they think will be useful for us. So I feel like as a student, I would have benefited more if Dr. Tamale had discussed some solutions as well as the problems. My third point has to do with China. So Dr. Tamale briefly mentioned China and other emerging powers here and there, but I feel like she left China off the hook, because in as much as the Western countries like UK are the forefathers of colonialism, the new colonialism that is incoming also has to do with a country like China. As you and I already know, China is already taking properties in certain countries in Africa. So I feel like we need to study that part too. And lastly, I want to talk about Africans. I think Dr. Tamale left Africans off the hook because after reading chapter 9 and the epilogue, I was left feeling like, what about the role we Africans have played? It is true that Judeo-Christian values were brought from the West. It is true that colonialism continues to happen in new forms, but we ourselves, does that mean we haven't made contributions to putting ourselves where we are today? So I think some emphasis on that would help. Before I go, I know I'm almost out of time. I would like to leave Dr. Tamale with some questions. I'm hoping that this could help with our discussion. So my first question to you, Dr. Tamale, you said that Africa cannot survive or grow if it does not include all genders and act from a united front. You also added that the continent needs indigenous scholars to lead its knowledge manufacturing. So my question to you is, how do we raise Pan-African feminist scholars? That's my first question. My second question to you is, this is a quote from you. Despite the strides made by feminist scholars, many in mainstream academia, even today, are yet to be convinced that feminist methodologies, approaches, and analysis in research are part of legitimate scientific inquiry. So my question is, how do we convince fellow African scholars and the public in general that our work as feminist scholars is worthy of recognition and attention? My third question is, you said we should not lose hope, which I agree with you. So I'm wondering, when you were writing this book, what is the Africa you want to see? And in your view, how long would it take for that Africa to materialize? And how much work do you really think we need to do to get to that point? My fourth question is, in the case of Africa and Africans unable to handle problems through, as discussed in your work, what do you see happening? I mean, what do you see happening in case Africa and Africans are not able to handle the issues you discuss in the book? What is the worst that could happen in your view? And then my last question to you. As mentioned earlier, challenging Western views today has consequences, as history has shown us. So my question is, how can we challenge Western dominance without losing our heads? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Della, for such an insightful reflection. We really appreciate that. Very, very thoughtful. I appreciate that. So I will now call on Dr. Tamale for her reflections on the two discussants, for a response to the two discussants' reflections. Dr. Tamale, you're welcome again.
Yes. Thank you very much, Eric and Amelia. Sorry, I didn't catch your African name. And I thank you very much for your generous comments and your very insightful critique of the book. I'll begin with Eric on the issue of the Latin American theorists, and his question, do we not employ the concept of coloniality at the risk of neglect of our experience as Africans? I actually referenced several African male theorists, including Senghor, Anta Diop, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Wadada Nawudere, Samir Amin, etc., quite extensively. There's no doubt that Nkrumah's theory of neocolonialism, which, by the way, was constructed around Marxist thought, was seminal in facilitating our understanding of international power structures and the continued imperialist exploitation of our post-independent in quotation marks, continent. Or even Anta Diop's rehistoricization and deconstruction of Eurocentric conceptualizations of civilization, relocating its origin from Greece to Africa and Asia. I also think that the relatively recent critical works of post-colonial theorists that has emerged out of Latin America is extremely useful to our decolonization and decolonial projects. Quijano's concept of coloniality of power and the subsequent works of theorists like Mignolo and Maldonado Torres on coloniality of being and so on, I think built upon the theoretical frameworks of thinkers like Nkrumah in the post-Cold War period, post-1990s, providing us with great epistemic tools for deepening our understanding of the various crises in Africa, including sex, gender, and sexuality. Indeed, their Latin American feminist counterpart, in the name of Maria Lugons, made a feminist critique of their works, usefully expanding it in the same way that Western radical feminists expanded and improved upon Michel Foucault's brilliant work on sexuality and governmentality that had been limited by his masculinist worldview. I don't think that by using concepts developed by Quijano, Mignolo, Torres, Lugons, or Foucault for that matter, in any way deducts from the analysis or experiences of Africans. Powerful anti-hegemonic critiques of dominant discourses and practices can emanate from people of all nationalities, of all skin colors, because imperialist dominance and neoliberalism is global. So we should not shy away from acknowledging them. The important issue is not to uncritically apply such concepts to our diverse contexts. In sum, we need to pursue a nuanced approach in all our analysis. As I argue in the book, Africa itself is so diverse that it is impossible to generalize about it as a continent. Its cultures are in a constant state of evolution and adaptation. So to argue that by using foreign concepts we are risking neglecting the experience of Africans, I think is to gloss over the deep complexities, differences, and fluidities of Africa and Africans. In the introductory part of the book, I take pains to explain my political use of the term Africans in the context of our decolonizing and decolonial projects. On the issue of why we use colonial terms such as colonial master, I totally agree with you, Derek, that language is a tool, Eric, that language is a tool of power and an object of struggle. I also agree 120% that the imperialists were parasitic interlopers, and that the term master suggests some kind of inherent superiority and gives credence to the lie of their civilizing, quote unquote, mission. I hope that the holistic reading of my book makes it clear that my references to colonial master do not imply an endorsement of such hierarchies. Actually, the list of terms that I would have had to place in inverted commas in order to distance myself from their colonial or Western legacy is much longer, you know, including man and woman, you know, black and white, you know, because by referring to ourselves as black, we're reinforcing those racial constructions that were made, you know, classifications that were made for us. But, you know, it would have become stylistically cumbersome. So I really hope that the holistic reading of the book solves the problem. But I really appreciate that point. Why do I still bear the colonial name Sylvia? The complex politics of names and naming. It would be interesting to find out whether the wife of that elder who pointed this out, that is if he's heterosexual married, excuse me, adopted his name as Mrs. X, whatever his name is, which as we know is a colonial relic. Feminists are very familiar with the interplay between naming, power, and politics, particularly the gendered and racial meanings they encode. I did not change my surname on marriage, so my husband is constantly referred to as Mr. Tamale, and it has become a running joke in our household. We were very careful in naming our two sons, and none of them bear colonial names. They're both named after two great Pan-Africanist presidents. Kwame, after Ghana's president, not because he was born on a Saturday, and Samora, after the Mozambican president. In South Africa, they were asked to swear an affidavit to prove that they were brothers because their surnames were different. They're expected to have followed the colonial culture of a family name. So yes, I appreciate the coloniality of names and naming, and I wish my parents had not given me a colonial name as a form of resistance. But the name Sylvia Tamale has become my hybrid identity. And that's how I choose to be known to the outside world, despite its political and colonial legacy. As Walter Mignolo tells us, each one of us is responsible for finding out where we are located in the colonial matrix and for our own decolonial liberation. No one else is responsible. We are responsible. So naming is significant for one's self-identity and subjectivity. And I have personally subverted coloniality at a personal level in so many different ways, including cutting loose the mooring or to colonial religiosity, for example. By the way, I know many Africans who do not bear Christian names, but continue to wear the colonial rosary or to dress in the morning coat and suit, black. So issues of coloniality are extremely complicated. The Western idea of forenames and surnames or family names also facilitates the construction and perpetuation of sex binaries, as well as gendered identities and hierarchies. So yes, it is extremely important that we give this issue attention. Finally, on this point, I draw a bright red line on the colonial naming of African places, roads, and landscapes. And I think Lake Victoria should be renamed Narubare, and Victoria Falls renamed Mosiha Tunya. I feel very strongly about that. Eric also mentioned about male scholars being dismissive of feminism. I totally agree with Eric on the attitudes of some male scholars on the issue of gender. Their dogged failure to analyze the confounding and intersectional oppressive relations based on race and gender, class, and so many other systems of oppression means that while they challenge one form of domination, they inadvertently reify others. So I would not agree with you more on that point. Amelia, on the issue of tribalism, I think the othering that comes with this notion of I know my identity based on what you are not, I think extends to our different nationalities or tribes, as the derogatory term tribe. When we emphasize us and them, whether it is based on race or gender or nationality, it is the same issue that othering is what explains why we practice sectarianism or what you call tribalism. And yes, although I don't think that the foundational basis or the foundational explanation of tribalism differs very much from this concept of othering, us, the in group, and the out group, us and them. And yes, I could have discussed it a little bit more, I agree, but I think it's all about that othering. How do we, as Africans, scholars and feminists, navigate the threat that the West poses to us in challenging its dominance without losing our heads? Well, Africa is extremely strategic for the sustenance of imperialist capitalism and neoliberal globalization. So yes, the West will do everything within its power to thwart our liberation, because they need us. They need us, they need to maintain the status quo as it is. So what is clear is that we cannot stand up to imperialism and neoliberalism as a balkanized continent of 54 relatively insignificant states. So that is impossible. We must strike down the geographical, linguistic, and ideological barriers that hinder our unity as a continent. We must see through it. We must really, acquire 2020 vision on this issue. And only if we operate as a bloc can we gain leverage to resist foreign exploiters. And to strengthen our capacity, we should link up. I think it's important for us to link up with the dispossessed masses in the global north, because there are many, including, our Black sisters and brothers, but beyond those, people that are classified as poor and immigrants and so on and so forth. So we need to grow a cadre of leaders who have a clear and unselfish vision of Pan-Africanism. And that is why my book really targets young students who have a bigger stake, because some of us we're in our evening years, but let us grow a cadre of leadership that will translate into who have a vision, an unselfish vision of Pan-Africanism that translates into a federation of the United States of Africa. Currently, our leadership on the continent, unfortunately, lacks that kind of vision, despite their rhetoric on the same. How do we create an inclusive space for divergent standpoints without making one another enemies? A comprehensive response to this question would be the subject matter of another book, obviously. My short answer is that we need to consciously practice the wet dog shape-off that I spoke about earlier. I think that we can begin taking baby steps towards our goal by overhauling the entire education system on the continent and erasing the blind spots that keep us chained to colonial structures. Internalizing the philosophy of Ubuntu from infancy, for example, would inculcate those values that foster compassion and tolerance for diversity. What else? Yes. Suggesting sub-solutions. I believe that the solutions in my book are implicit in the problem that I highlight. When, for example, you understand that binary understandings of the world were imposed by colonialists to serve their imperialist agendas, their interests, then it's likely that you will better appreciate non-binary political identities and non-binary ideas. The wide spectrum of grays that lie between a hierarchical black and white worldview, we can begin to explore that gray area once we have recognized that binary understandings are very limiting. Throughout the book, I also highlight the potential of tapping into the ideals and practices of Ubuntu as another possible solution to shaking off our coloniality. How do we raise Pan-African feminist scholars, and how do we convince fellow African scholars and the public at large that our work as feminist scholars is worthy? Three important things I would point out on this one. Number one is clarity. Number two is clarity. And number three is clarity. As Africans, we really need to raise our awareness on a multiplicity of issues to gain clarity of the internal and external obstacles that stand in our way of progress clarity of analysis, clarity of vision and direction, clarity of what, why, and how, clarity of the big picture of achieving social justice, clarity of ecosystemic connections. The list goes on and on. I sincerely hope that my book represents a small contribution towards clarifying some of these issues. What is the Africa you want to see, that I want to see, that I want to see, and how long would it take to materialize? Whoa. This reminds me of the African Union's Agenda 2063 under the slogan, the Africa we want. 2023, in 3 years, 2023 will mark the first decade of the 50-year implementation of the strategic agenda of the AU, but we're yet to feel its implementation. In my mind's vision, the Africa I see is one that emerges out of a political cultural revolution. And the Africa that will rise out of that revolution will be a united one in a non-imperialist, borderless federation of United States of Africa. There will be no hungry or homeless people. You know, there will be healthcare for all. It will be an Africa that embraces those positive aspects of our culture, our different cultures, our very rich cultures that enhance our humanity. It will be an Africa with economies that are not run through the logic of competition, through the logic of market and profit prioritization. It will be an Africa with people living together harmoniously despite their differences, recognizing our humanity as, you know, people living together. And it will be an Africa whose dispute resolution mechanisms do not emphasize retribution and incarceration, but reconciliation and reparation. I could go on and on. What is the worst case scenario for Africa if we continue on this road, the road that we are currently on? You know, if we continue business as usual, I think our great-grandchildren, you know, my generation, our great-grandchildren will be seeing a much wider gap between the haves and have-nots, with these AU, African Union decolonizers who resemble the colonizers of yesteryears, you know, working closer and closer, much closer with imperialists, you know, the African comprador enablers, working hand in hand with the Europeans, the Americans, the Chinese, the South Koreans, and all those people. And the gap between the haves and have-nots widening more and more. The political, economic, and religious corruption will skyrocket, with no institutions calling for serious accountability if we continue on this road. There will be, our great-grandchildren will be struggling much more than we are to make ends meet and to feed their families. Their cultural and identity roots will be skin deep with much weaker social relations. Arable land will become increasingly scarce and land disputes will escalate. It's a very grim picture 2 generations from now, if we continue business as usual, Let me just say that I don't want to imagine such a scenario. And it's part of the reason why I'm involved in this work and why I developed this book. Let me stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tamale. Clarity of analysis, vision, and the big picture of everything else that's going on. We have a lot to grapple with, but we are on our way. We will get there. At this point, I'd like to open the floor for questions and comments. And if you do so only in the chat, please. Once I get those, I will read them out to Dr. Tamale or Na and Della, and they can take those questions and answer them, please. I have a few already that I'd like to read out. The first one actually came yesterday, and it is, are there pre-colonial experiences about non-binary identities and non-binary experiences of sexuality from our continent that could be shared to inspire us in the quest of defining who we are independently of the binaries imposed by colonization?
Indeed. The book discusses at some length issues of non-binary identities and experiences. In fact, the entire chapter 4 of the book is devoted to these issues, where I juxtapose the case of Caster Semenya, the South African athlete, to that of Michael Phelps, the American swimmer. I provide some examples of traditional acceptance of intersexuality and transgenderism on the continent, including concepts like Mudoko Dako among the Langi of Uganda, or Chibados among the Ibangala of Angola. This is certainly a topic that needs much more research, because I don't think we have excavated the topic deep enough. But certainly, non-binary identities existed on the continent, and they were accepted. They were not criminalized. They were not, dehumanized in the same way that we see the transphobia, homophobia, and so on that was introduced to the continent by colonial laws and practices.
Okay, thank you very much. Indeed. Another question says, how can we commit to being critical of the continent and our role in all the chaos without undermining the colonial legacy? How can we commit to being critical of the continent and our role in all the chaos without undermining the colonial legacy?
We want to undermine the colonial legacy. So I'm not sure what that participant means. I think the whole project of decolonization and decoloniality wants to undermine the legacies of colonialism, because most of the suffering, people who say we continue blaming colonialism, we're tired of hearing these stories, but actually we still live under colonialism. It's just a different type, a different kind. It may not be physical. And that's why, theorists like Mignolo will never use the word post-colonialism, because it gives the impression that we are in a post-colonial state, post-colonial conditions, when we are not. It's the mechanisms, the trappings, that have changed, but we are still very much, the simple example of names, says it all. We still hold their names, we celebrate their celebrations. Like the other day, I was shocked to see on TV some hotel here in Kampala advertising what do they call that Friday where they trick whatever, what's it called? Halloween, yes. They were advertising Halloween, and I'm like, goodness, everything, our ways of thinking, our ways of doing are still very, very colonial. So to say that we should stop blaming colonialism, I'm sorry, for me is an indicator that we lack that clarity that I was talking about. Okay, so for me, my aim, I think our aim must be, our number one objective is to undermine, subvert colonial legacies. That's what we are fighting for.
Yeah, this next question really grapples with and addresses some of the issues that decolonial scholars aim to do, which is to subvert this tendency to be closer to whiteness, where we tend to seek validation from the dominant culture. How do we do that? And so this next question says, do African feminists need validation from anywhere?
Do African feminists need validation? I think any activist in any social movement, because all social movements are struggling for a very specific cause, and they are part of that cause, fighting for the social justice for a specific social group. Feminists focus on social justice for women. And so I think their number one accountability should be to women, African women. So they should be accountable to African women. If, for example, as a feminist organization, a non-government organization, you apply to donors for funding to implement your programs, you are doing that on behalf of your constituency, which is made up of women, whether it is battered women, women living with HIV, whatever it is. So your work must be validated by those women. You are accountable first and foremost to those women. That's what I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Another question in the chat says, how does and this is a single worry from the participant. He says, how has the pre-colonial order in Africa addressed the problematic of patriarchy? And to what extent have they been successful?
So we're
looking at, yes, it says, how has the post-colonial order in Africa address the problem of patriarchy, and to what extent have they been successful? So talking about patriarchy and its constant impact, how have we been successful in problematizing that?
Well, first of all, I think we can never talk about patriarchy in isolation. Patriarchy and capitalism are like Siamese twins, sharing the same heartbeat, reinforcing each other. So how has it been fought? I think the feminist movement and the women's rights movement on the continent has spent decades struggling to dismantle structures of heteropatriarchal capitalism. I think the reason, how far have we gone? We haven't, I don't think, in my view, I don't think we have achieved a lot of success. And I attribute that to the fact that our struggles have been steeped in coloniality. We have been, we haven't been as, excuse me, we have not been as aware and as critical as we should be of certain fundamental concepts like gender equality, like gender, women's empowerment and so on. And because of that, I think that explains why we seem to be working like, like pouring water through a basket, or, going round and round in circles and not achieving much. I think we really need, that's why I emphasize clarity. We really need to understand, for example, the link between, or the centrality of sexuality to gender, to women's subordination. Most women's rights activists don't make that link. Their logic is blurred by concepts like religion, and that is why they would not touch with the longest broom the issues that relate to lesbians, for example, sex workers, because they don't see, they can't connect the dots between sexuality, the control and regulation of women's sexuality, to these to coloniality and how our worldview that has been so shaped by colonial concepts. So that is not to say that we have not gained any victories. But as I said in my introduction, I think we are celebrating half-baked victories because, for example, we may have won some cases in the formal courts, but when we recognize that in countries like Uganda, only 5% of citizens actually run to the formal courts for conflict resolution or for redress, that really tells us that, for various reasons, your common wananchi don't run to court. It's too expensive, it's too intimidating, it's too, they just don't go there. So even when we win cases or win law reform in Parliament, it is only a tiny little percentage, small percentage of elite women that benefit from those victories. So we still have a lot of work to do, and I think the first thing we need to do is gain clarity. And we can only do that by really understanding these projects of decolonization and decoloniality.
Thank you very much. These I'm going to lump two questions together because they are about the same idea. Speaks to indigenous knowledge, right? Our local systems, and one of them, the first of the two says, could you share your thoughts on the use of our local language in academic writing as a form of decolonization? And then the next one, which is related, is how do we integrate recognizing Western theories and theorizing based on African norms and ideals?
In the chapter on decolonizing the African Academy, I I discuss some of the challenges that we face. I think that ideally we should be using our local languages in formal education, because it doesn't matter how brilliant, how bright, how smart you are, if the medium of communication in class is a language that is very alienating, that is very foreign, that you don't understand, that will limit your appreciation of whatever it is that is being communicated. So I think we need to begin work on finding common groupings of languages, indigenous languages, and start teaching in those languages as we work on the bigger project of having a common language on the continent. I know this is huge and a very, very daunting challenge, but it can be done. It could be, Wolof, Swahili, whatever it is, we can all learn these languages. But we can before we get there, we can begin in our own, locations and find languages that share. I mean, Tanzania did it with Swahili. Why can't Uganda do it? Why do we continue, twisting our tongues with languages that are so difficult for us to comprehend? So the issue of languages as part of culture is extremely important, and to our understandings of the problems that we face as Africans. So language, and then content of what is taught, and then the pedagogical approaches to learning. Storytelling must be emphasized. Most of us Africans understand that through storytelling, you learn much more effectively than your teacher standing in front of you like this know-it-all human being and teaching you. So I think language is one of many challenges that we have in terms of promoting our understanding using indigenous ways of knowing, ways of thinking. What is the second one? I'm sorry.
The second one, which is also related, had to do with how we theorize using our own native indigenous knowledge. Because oftentimes when we write, and this person is specifically citing how in doctoral education we are, encouraged to use Western theories. And she's asking, how do we use our own indigenous knowledge as theories? How do we theorize from our knowledge, intellectual traditions? You mentioned storytelling, like proverbs and appellations and things like that.
Yes, because that question presupposes that we are not currently theorizing. I think we theorize based on our everyday experiences. We're always theorizing. I think when you imagine theory to be these big, huge, jargonistic concepts, then you don't realize that you yourself, you're always, on a daily basis, you're theorizing. Because theory is about explaining, answering the why questions about life, about being able to explain what is going on. And of course we can do that in our indigenous languages. Africans have been doing it through proverbs, through storytelling, through poetry, and that is theorizing. I think that the main problem is our conception of what amounts to theory is what is blocking our understanding of whether we are theorizing or not. But we have always been theorizing and we'll continue to theorize. What we need to do is to foreground our theories. Foreground, that is why, for example, I used poetry in the book, because poetry is excellent in, using it's a very succinct genre of delivering very powerful messages. And so, yes, we can use our indigenous ways of knowing to theorize, and we've been doing it. We just maybe haven't been acknowledging and recognizing it as such.
The next two questions that I'm going to lump together is about Pan-Africanism, Afrocentrism, and Afrofuturism. And when we discuss these two movements, oftentimes as Africans, we don't seem to know where to place ourselves. And in that same vein, this next question talks about, our collecting histories and reconstructing narratives. What does that mean? How does Pan-Africanism and Afrofuturism, Afrocentrism, how do those things allow us to reconstruct our narratives and collective histories?
I think there is a lot that we don't know about our history as African people, which is such a shame, and which was very deliberately done. Our histories were erased by colonialism. And I took European history at A level. I did history, and we learned about the French Revolution, but not about the Haitian Revolution, which took place around the same time. It happened around the same time. What is placed on the syllabus erases our knowledge, or it invisibilizes some of the very powerful histories of our ancestors, of our people. Now, if you, I really believe, that's why I talk about transdisciplinarity. All of us must be historians, because history is about the past, it's about the present, and it's about the future. So without history, we are nothing. We have to dig deep and find those histories. Actually, those histories exist. It's just that we, you know, our visions are blocked from accessing them. We must access. It is so frustrating, you know, when you look at the syllabus, for example, of our children in primary school, where it is on the formal syllabus in the national curriculum, where they're told, this little 6-year-old, a little boy whose single mother works very hard to put food on his table together with his 5 siblings to pay their fees. And he sees how his mother struggles on a daily, working double shifts in her nursing job. And he goes to class and his teacher tells him that head of your family is your father. And if he dares to put up his hand and challenge because of his lived experience, because what the teacher is telling him doesn't resonate with his reality, he would be punished for it. That is the kind of education that we have. Rote learning, cramming nonsense, doing more cramming, regurgitating it at the end of the semester or the term or the year, and moving on, you know, this education conveyor belt. And within a few months, you've forgotten what you crammed. And, you know, we really have to overhaul our whole education system and change the way we teach, the content of what we teach, and get rid of this coloniality. So Afrocentric studies will go a long way in, you know, unearthing, uncovering the wonderful history. Those volumes of which I cite in the book about the history of Africa. I think all of us, they must be compulsory reading for all of us. And all the volumes are available, free access online. They just talk about our history as a continent, Egypt. And when we talk about ancient Egypt, you know, it's not that history is not talking about, you know, people Arab origin that live in Egypt today, but Egypt that had Black people like us, and where the civilization, which was the credo of civilization. How many Africans know this history? Very, very few. You know, because we are left in the dark about this history. So I think by uncovering our very rich history that has been skewed, that has been, distorted, it will go a long way in our emancipatory project.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tamale. This next one is about globalization. And she says, in terms of collectivist paradigms, how does one balance focus of the advancement of the African Black family globally and at the same time addressing inequities of gender? Globally, we seem to have difficulty doing both or relating both at the same time.
Globalization and? Sorry, I didn't get it.
Yeah, so how does one balance the focus of the advancement of the African Black family and at the same time addressing inequities of gender?
inequities of gender and
at the same time addressing the African Black family globally.
I don't see the I don't see the problem there. How are they saying that the two are irreconcilable?
Yes, that is what the person is Beverly is saying. How do we address those irreconcilable differences seemingly?
First of all, in the book, I avoid the term gender equality for reasons that I expound on in there. And I prefer gender justice. And I think that gender justice would enhance Africa's progress. Social justice generally would enhance Africa's progress. Having an Africa that is inclusive of everyone, inclusive of everyone's, dignity and humanity would definitely enhance. So I don't see why. I think the reason why people look at what the feminist struggle for gender justice as a threat is because maybe they imagine that we are seeking to to overturn the hierarchy so that women are on top, or constructing them as superior. But no. I think anyone, whether you're a man or a woman, all of us have sisters, we have mothers, we have aunties, and I don't think any of us would like to see our sisters, our mothers, our nieces and aunties, being oppressed, being treated unjustly. So gender justice is simply about recognizing the humanity, the dignity of that social group called women that have been, termed women. And studies, actually economic studies have shown that if with gender justice, societies, communities that have higher incidence indices of gender justice progress much faster than those that oppress and discriminate and subjugate women. So I don't see any disconnect there.
These next two questions have to do with archives and histories, and one of them is particular in how it says, why is it that customary codes and sometimes religious codes in some African countries take precedence over the national constitution, which recognizes gender equality? So looking at institutions, archives, and so forth. And the next one asks about, whether we can find, our histories in archival libraries, such as the one in Timbuktu and in West Asian antique and modern libraries. How could these institutions help us unearth our histories?
I think those archives would go a long way, and they've been used by many scholars to uncover our histories. Very rich. The other day, it was a few years ago in the conflict, we saw some of these archives, Timbuktu archives, being destroyed, that was really, really a low moment on the continent. The issue of customary law, actually in most African countries, customary law does not take precedence over the national constitution. As far as I know, in all countries, the constitution is the premier law of the land. It overtakes all other laws, including customary law. But in the book, I undertake a decolonial analysis of customary law, because what we normally term customary law actually is not, it has nothing to do with indigenous ways of knowing. It is very colonial. Customary law was a colonial concept which attempted to ossify customary law, cast it in stone, and to deny it of its natural oxygen that makes it evolve and dynamic. So I distinguish between what I call colonial customary law and living customary law. And despite in spite of its depiction as backward and always pitting it against rights, actually living customary law is much more progressive than written colonial laws. And what feminists have done on the continent, and I give several examples in, I think it's chapter 4, is to use that concept of living customary law and the progressive provisions in our constitution to achieve some legal victories in courts, and through PIL, that is public interest litigation. But as I said earlier, these are very limited. Those victories are very limited. But yeah, customary law is not, it doesn't take precedence over constitution.
Thank you. This one just came in, but before I get to that one, there is one about feminist theorizing, and it is, how do we begin to connect the theoretic to the programmatic when talking about gender and feminism in Africa? How do we grow the institutional framework that brings these concepts and theories to the fore of development on the continent? The theoretic to the programmatic. How do we
I think we can do that. We can do that through a collaboration between the activists on the ground and the theorists in the academy. I think that that the practice should inform the theory, and the theory should be informed by the practice. The practice should inform theory, and theory should inform the practice. I think if you work on the ground blindly, if you implement your programs blindly without paying attention to theories, to explanations of why whatever you're addressing with, say, violence against women, then you will be like a doctor that prescribes aspirin for a headache without doing tests to find out, to diagnose what the root cause of that headache is. So you may begin implementing your program against, for example, domestic violence by prescribing you know, what do they call it? Oh, there are these programs that they run that are supposed to violence, like someone who's hot-tempered, who has a red fuse, and you take them for, what are they called? Oh gosh, there are these programs that are very popular that you go for. Amma, you don't know what I'm talking about.
Anger management?
Anger management, yes. Anger management programs. I mean, anger management program is not going to address the root causes of gender-based violence. You're just scratching, facilitating a symptom of the root cause. So I think that the two should inform each other. Theory and practice, they must work hand in hand.
I have one last, and it's a comment, and the participant is suggesting that either Professor Tamale or any the discussants can address this. And she says, what is the professor's and peers' thoughts on the term Afropolitanism, popularized by Professor Achille Mbembe, which refers to a way of being and existing as an African citizen in Africa and abroad, which rejects all pretensions to victimhood?
Amelia or Eric?
Afropolitanism.
Afropolitanism. For me, it's a great term. There's this Ghanaian female writer, I've forgotten her name. She wrote about this. And for me, it allows us to remove that boundary between Africans in the diaspora and Africans on the continent, because through this, we see ourselves as one people trying to fight one. Those of us who are in school, in Western spaces will tell you that, like personally, the first time somebody ever called me Black is when I went to America. And this means that whether I'm directly from Africa or I'm African American does not matter. Whatever the person is using is what he or she sees in me, and that brings the label. So I feel like it is super important that we work together as people of African descent, no matter where we find ourselves. And I think this term Afropolitanism really helps us to do that. So it's a term that I agree with.
Okay, Eric? Eric, do you have, do you have anything to...
I'd say I've seen the term, and but I don't consider myself well read sufficiently about it to make a comment. So I'll pass. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Does Dr. Tamale want to respond to or say anything, comment on the this topic of Afropolitanism?
No, I don't. I
Okay.
Like Eric, I don't know enough about it.
All right, sounds good. So I think then that is all the questions I see, or comments. And then someone made a comment saying, Afropolitanism is also implicated in the neoliberal capitalist hegemony. Let's beware, not all concepts with Afro in it works for the continent. Right, and so we shouldn't embrace everything that comes with Afro. Some of them are dubious, in other words. I don't see any other questions here, unless someone has a really burning question that he or she would like to, or they would like to put up here, or comment. Going once, going
Ahmad,
twice.
I saw, we've run out of time anyway, but I saw a comment, somebody was asking if a soft copy, a
of your
PDF
book
copy of the book is available. most certainly. That person can email me. I think the easiest email to give you here is my Yahoo one. My initial S, tamale@yahoo.com. I'll send you the PDF copy.
Okay, so her email is stamale, STAMALE @yahoo.com. I'm going to put it in the chat for everyone. Here we go.
And
So
please,
it's
Chair, anybody who registered for this event actually received an email with a link connecting that person to the PDF of the book. So if you register for this event, check the email you received. You will find a link there that will take you to the ebook.
okay, thank you very much for that, Chika. So as Chika just mentioned, if you registered for the event, you should have received a copy of the a PDF version of the book. But if you did not, please feel free to contact Dr. Tamale at stamale@yahoo.com, and she will send you a copy directly. Friends, our elders say, talking about decolonization, our elders say, "Our growing year, they know na adia recent for." The more enjoyable the function is getting, it is also getting late for non-resident spectators. So unfortunately, I'd like to bring this celebration to a close. Thank you all for participating in this wonderful celebration and conversation and insightful comments and questions. As we say, a good conversation never ends. So let's continue to pull up our chairs for this good soup and these important dialogues. Please join me in thanking Dr. Tamale, Na, and Della for their heartfelt and insightful offerings and scholarship. Please also join me in thanking Chika and all the other organizers and stakeholders in putting together such a wonderful gathering. It is so filling. We need more of this. We need more of such spaces to be us, to celebrate us, to draw on the knowledge of our ancestors and their wisdom to better ourselves as we proceed and move forward through this really daunting decolonization project. We can do it. Dr. Tamale, congratulations for your achievement. You truly have crowed. Please keep crowing. Do not stop crowing. Congratulations. Kokroko. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful day. Please crow, crow, crow. Till we meet again, friends and family. Goodbye for now.
Asante sana. Asante sana.
Thank you, Prof.